learning more and more about the man behind New York City's failed terror plot. Faisal Shahzad, the 30-year-old, had a master's degree and held a job as a budget analyst. But while there are some answers, many questions remain, like what provoked a guy who seemed to be living the American dream to want to target other Americans for death? Joining me now to discuss this are Alia Malik, an attorney and author of A Country Called America, Paul Cruikshank, CNN terrorism consultant, Raihan Sulam, a columnist for the Daily Beast and a fellow at the New American Foundation. Welcome to the show, you guys. You heard the description, 30 years old, married with children, a budget analyst, a master's degree. Why does someone with that sort of profile, why are they drawn to this type of behavior?
Well, I think those are some of the relevant factors about him, but I'm also interested in the fact that, you know, he lost his house in a foreclosure. He seemed to not be able to adjust fully to being part of a diaspora community here in the United States. He seemed torn between whether to live in Pakistan or the United States. I mean, this is all speculation, but I'm not sure that we fully know the details that are relevant to understanding the why.
Mm-hmm. But if he seems to be anti-American, right? We can assume that, Paul?
I think we can assume that if he was trying to attack Times Square, the crossroads of America, he had some anti-American views. This may be a case of radicalization. It may be a case of somebody being radicalized in the United States. We don't know exactly where he was radicalized. But with a lot of these people, a lot of these cases, they come to believe that the United States is at war with Islam, and they feel that they need to fight back. That's the belief that a lot of these people who get involved in terrorism, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's Europe, or whether it's now in America, that's the belief that they have, Joy.
Mm-hmm. But is there some kind of a growing tide of people who are being radicalized in this country?
That's right. The counterterrorism officials believe that there is growing radicalization now in the United States. Mm-hmm. In the last year, we've had 16 cases of Americans becoming implicated in terrorism. That's a surge in the number of these cases. So there's real concern about radicalization in the United States. Why is it happening? Well, it's complicated. The internet is playing some role. Social media is playing some role. But also radical preachers are increasingly self-confident, spreading al-Qaeda's message here in the United States. Some of them are even active just a few blocks away from where we are now, Joy.
Is that so?
Absolutely. CNN has done quite a lot of reporting on this. Drew Griffin profiling a group called Revolution Muslim. This is a pro-Al-Qaeda group operating in New York. The First Amendment gives them that right, and they do spread some of this ideology.
Let's get a little bit into the motivation, possibly. I mean, the New York Post today is a newspaper in New York. Some credibility, I think. Don't you? It reported that it was retaliation for the drone killings on the Taliban in Afghanistan. Do you think that this was his motivation to retaliate against the drone attacks? And, I mean, what do you make of that? The drones were a retaliation for 9/11. It seems like it's a vicious cycle, doesn't it, Rihan?
Well, you know, the drone attacks are really interesting because basically you sometimes have some collateral damage that's happening as a result of these attacks. And it's one of these thorny things because we don't want to endanger our military personnel in Afghanistan. So the drones have been very valuable in that regard. Yeah. But on the other hand, you know, we have this very complicated task there, trying to win over the population while also trying to eliminate these folks who are incredibly dangerous. Mm-hmm. And then there's this other feeling on the part of a lot of Americans of, well, we're sacrificing all of these soldiers there, and yet the population seems so resentful and so angry about this collateral damage. So it's this very weird relationship. And yeah, you've got a lot of folks on both sides of that border, which is a very porous border, who feel this deep personal connection to the Taliban. They feel like, well, these guys are speaking for us, etc. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not surprising that there's going to be some resentment. What is surprising is how does it go through this really long, extended chain? I'm 30 years old. I was, you know, born in Brooklyn, and I'm a South Asian guy. And you look at a guy like this, naturalized citizen, married a woman born in the United States. It's just, you know, very disconcerting in a way. Yes. And how did he suddenly get activated and energized by these concerns that you'd think that folks over there would have? Mm-hmm. We know that suicide bombing tends to happen when, you know, people feel as though they're under military occupation. So you see it in, you know, the occupied territories in the West Bank, you see it in Iraq, places like that. Right. And you can see it, it's immediate. You know what I mean? You see people, their doors getting knocked down, that kind of thing, and you get angry. But then again, this guy was living in Connecticut. So it is a real puzzle. And then it, you know, begs the question of, was he just a weird, eccentric guy who was looking for some,
right.
Joy, if I could actually interject, I think that there's sort of two separate questions that we're conflating here. I mean, the idea of why there might be animus against the United States and within the country and outside of the country is a question that isn't necessarily going to enlighten us as to why this specific individual turned to violence as a means to express the dissent that he might possibly feel. And I might be elevating his concerns to the level of dissent. He might just be a complete sociopath. But because as having gone on book tour with this book, I got asked this question a lot as to why are we seeing people being radicalized. But I would say that 16 cases out of a massively much larger community of several million people is not really not really that much of a significant number. And I think that for somebody to be angry at the United States, plenty of people were dissented from the policies of, for example, the Bush administration, and they, all of us as Americans helped put Barack Obama into power. But to go from being dissenting from American policy to actually thinking that violence against innocent people is a legitimate means, I think has something to do with the specificity of that individual's life. When I started researching this, and in the piece I wrote for the Christian Science Monitor, I talked to a lot of psychologists, and I think psychologists are somebody who, people who should be included in this conversation, because they often point out that these are the middle or youngest children. Sometimes they've had issues with a parent who's abandoned the family, they have issues with their father. We know that this man's father was high up in the military. Maybe he failed him in some ways.
The individual who behaves this way, but it doesn't really explain the overall feelings of animosity towards us from Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and all these other groups that are really out to kill us. So, I mean, yes, that's the operative, might be explained that way. But I'm always confused about, do these people hate us because of our policies abroad, our policies about Israel, or do they hate us the way Bush used to say, they just hate our lifestyles? I mean, that's what confuses me.
In most cases, it's probably because of the policies, because of the foreign policy. They have this conspiracy theory about the United States, that the United States wants to wage war against Islam. And some of these people really do believe that. Of course, that's not the case, but they come to believe this. It's not because of the freedoms or anything like this.
No, because there are plenty of other countries that have the similar freedoms, like Scandinavian countries, and they don't seem to be ticked off at them unless there's a cartoon
States has invaded Iraq
involved
for corporate interests and has remained, So
if we pulled out of Afghanistan, and the Israelis figured out their whole thing with the Palestinians, and we became free of foreign oil, and we did not have any obligation to the Middle East in any way, do you think they would stop hating us? That's my question.
I think sociopaths hate us for the reason. I mean, they have their own reasons.
Well,
they also garner their own power. But I think there are people
they would still hate us.
I think there are people. I think sociopaths. But I think there are people who have sympathies or find there to be some truth in their beliefs.
But wouldn't it be harder to recruit these sociopaths?
Yes, I definitely think it would be harder. The constituency would shrink.
Yes.
I wonder about that. I mean, I think that, Paul spoke to something I think very important, which is that you're talking about these political cultures that are conspiratorial by nature. So even when you're talking about Pakistani domestic politics, go to any tea shop and listen to how they're talking about the leadership structure, the way things work, the way the world works. It's just baked in the cake. You see this in even, moderate Muslim societies. If you look at Turkey, for example, and the so-called Severus paranoia, this very deep paranoia about what foreigners are out to do to the Turks. And the United States happens to be a very outsized society in the imagination of people around the world, not only in the Muslim world. And so when you kind of layer on this conspiratorial political culture over this huge role that American culture plays around the world, then it happens that, more people know about the United States than they do about the Danes. And guess what? After those Danish cartoons that seemed to offend Muhammad, you suddenly saw angry, furious rioting and also death threats against those peace-loving Danes who, again, they've taken part in NATO military operations and what have you, but they're not the United States.
In light of what you're saying, what do you make of this other thing with Comedy Central? Are we supposed to never make a joke? No one's supposed to ever say anything about the Prophet Muhammad,
what we need to accept is that danger is part of life. If you look at what happened in Britain under assault from the IRA for an incredibly long period of time, the way they ultimately defeated the IRA is by hardening their society and demonstrating that we are not going to turn away, we're not going to abandon our policies simply through this kind of coercion. If you look at what happened after Margaret Thatcher was almost killed by the IRA in a massive, massive attack, you just saw a society that accepted that, we lived through the Blitz, and we're going to live through this as well. The truth is that, when we engage in this tremendous paranoia and fear over people who are basically incompetent boobs, 9 times out of 10, you know, I think that actually paralyzes us, because part of freedom, part of having a free society, is accepting some level of vulnerability. We are not going to be able to harden ourselves the way that Israel hardened itself.
Okay.
That's just a fact.
Jump in.
I just would sort of like to add what my personal experience has been interviewing people across the country and across the Middle East on this issue. I don't think it's about being conspiratorial by nature. You know, that's not the ethos of the society that drives it. I think there's a deep disappointment, especially amongst the people that have always sort of seen the United States and its values as a beacon, you know, as the city on the hill.
Yes.
There's this deep disappointment, and as an American, I'm deeply disappointed when sometimes we fail to live up to our own ideals and the sorts of policies we enact overseas. And when that's the face that you see of this country, and at the same time that we profess to sort of be that beacon, and when we have been that beacon, because, you know, a lot of these people have family members who have immigrated to the United States. I don't think the United States is a complete other to them. And, you know, people go back and forth, and they are exposed to our other values. But there is this disappointment and amazement that we don't live up to our own ideals.
I wish that other Islamic countries would speak out more also. Can I just add that? Anyway, thank you all very much. Very interesting.